Story 28. Apparently, I was the AP. I, 30 male, met Rachel, 28 female, at a bar about 6 months ago. I had been out with some friends after work on a Friday night, and we had run into a group of ladies at this bar having what looked like a girls' night out. They were doing a lot of laughing and whispering and more laughing. As guys, we spent a lot of time looking at the girls' group, and they noticed. Glances and smiles were exchanged, and we sent some fresh drinks to their table. The girls all lifted a glass to us when the round was delivered to their table. It only took another half hour or so until both groups had moved to a large table and were chatting away. Some of my friends paired off naturally with some of the ladies, and I met and chatted with Rachel for a couple of hours. We talked about hobbies, where we wanted to be in 10 years, foods we liked, etc. It was an amazing conversation, and I found her to be as engaging intellectually as she was attractive. As the night ended, I got a vibe that she would be happy to connect again, but she didn't outright say it. Eventually, I courageously asked her if I could have her number. She smiled at me nervously and said that she'd take mine instead. I laughed and said sure, and told her my number. I was disappointed because this interaction is normally a nice way for women to say thank you, but no. I think she could read my disappointment from my face or body language. She gave me a genuine smile, told me it was nice to have met, and thanked me for a pleasant conversation. She then left with her co-workers. I assumed I'd never hear from her again and continued with my life. About 2 weeks later, I got a text message from a number that wasn't on my contacts list. I opened it, and it was from Rachel. She said she meant to get back to me earlier and wanted to let me know that she enjoyed that evening together. I waited a couple of hours, giving myself time to think about what I wanted to say. I texted her back, saying thank you, and that it was just as enjoyable for me. I asked her how she was doing, trying to see if I could break the ice or if this was just her being polite. She replied almost immediately, giving me a spark of hope. Over the next week or so, we would exchange several messages daily. We moved away from texting and settled on a social media messaging app. Rachel was always friendly and fun, but never moved the relationship forward, so I mirrored her approach. This lasted for a month until, finally, she commented that some of her friends were going out again and asked if my friends would like to run into us with a laughing emoji. I jumped on it and told her that I'd pull together a group, and we'd be there. When I mentioned it to my friends, it was unanimously decided that we'd be going. We all met up at the bar, just like the last time. We smiled and waved, and within a few minutes, both groups moved to the big table. Rachel and I grabbed a couple of chairs next to each other and started chatting again. She has big brown eyes with these little flecks of yellow, and every time I held her eyes with mine, I would get lost in them. Our conversation, like before, stayed in the safe zone, and we just hung out, talking like we'd known each other for years instead of a couple of months. When it started getting late, a couple of our friends peeled off the group and left together, and we finally ended up sitting at the table by ourselves, laughing and chatting. Rachel looked around and finally noticed we were alone. She checked the time and excused herself to go to the bathroom. She returned to the table a while later, and I'd already cleared our bill. She shyly said that we should probably get going. I agreed and told her I had a wonderful time. I walked her out to her car, watching her to ensure she seemed okay. Neither of us had drunk much, but I wanted to make sure she was good to drive. I stood with her at her car door, and she hugged me. I held her and enjoyed the feeling of just having her in my arms. When I pulled back, she kept her arms around me and looked up into my eyes. I asked her if everything was okay, and she said she was just happy to be there with me and was sad that the night was ending. She was giving me an opening, so I jumped on it. I casually mentioned that since it was technically Saturday and I didn't have to work, I would allow myself to stay out late. She laughed and asked if I wanted to get some coffee at an all-night diner she knew of. I agreed and followed her there. We drank coffee and had some pie. Later, I could tell she was getting tired, so I offered to let her go get some rest. Rachel looked at me like she wanted to say something but hesitated. I asked her what it was, and she just looked down and blushed. I stood up and offered her my hand, and she took it. We walked back out to her car, and I held her again, leaning down and kissing her. As soon as our lips touched, she leaned into me, returning the kiss. She didn't stop kissing, and I was getting a little excited with her in my arms like this. I finally pulled away and jokingly said I needed to stop before getting too worked up. She giggled and said she could tell it was too late, glancing down at me. I must have blushed or looked embarrassed because she pushed herself into me hard and pulled my head down to kiss her more. Things got a bit blurry from there. She asked if my place was nearby, leaving it an open question. I told her it was close enough. She followed me back to my house, and we spent the rest of the night in bed together. The next few months flew by. We spent as much time together as our schedules would allow. She stayed over at my place fairly regularly. When I asked about her place, she said she had a roommate who made it clear they would not be okay with her having a stayover guest. This was fine by me. Our relationship continued to grow over the next few months. I must admit that I am madly in love with Rachel, and she seemed very much in love with me. It only took another month or so before we traded our first "I love you." My first actual red flag was the realization that we never went out with any of her friends in a dating scenario. It hit me one day when we discussed our schedules and found a day that worked for her. I mentioned that a couple of our co-workers had also started dating and said we should call them and see if they wanted to go out. Rachel freaked out, saying she didn't like double dating and preferred not to advertise our relationship to her friends yet. She then begged me to make sure I wasn't sharing our relationship with any of my friends. This was a hard red flag for me, and she stayed evasive when I questioned her about it. I took it as she didn't see our relationship like I did. I just said okay and said maybe we should cancel. She seemed confused and upset, and I ended the conversation by saying I had to go. I sent her an honest text and said if she didn't want her friends to know about me, I needed to think about our relationship. I was still pretty clueless at this point. About a half hour later, she started blowing up my phone with texts, but I left them unread and sat at my place feeling sorry for myself. I was mad and just wanted to sulk. I know that everyone reading this knows the feeling. About a half hour later, Rachel's car pulled into my driveway, and she knocked on my door. I opened the door, ready to have it out with her, and it was a guy standing there with a pissed-off look on his face. I'm confused, trying to figure out who this was because I know Rachel's car was in my driveway. He asks me how I know Rachel, making me more confused, but things are finally starting to click. I tell him that I met her 6 months before at a bar. He then demands that I tell him about our relationship. I'm not an idiot. I ignore his question and ask him who he is. The guy tells me he's Rachel's husband and wants to know about my relationship with Rachel. I was stunned and quickly got angry. My phone was ringing again, and the ringtone was the one set up for Rachel, so I ignored it. I stepped back, invited this guy in, and offered him a seat. He looked mad, but accepted. I then told him that Rachel and I had been together for the last 4 months, and that I had no idea she was married. We spent the next hour talking about the situation, and the guy thanked me for my honesty, but demanded I stop seeing Rachel and left. It seems like her husband, let's call him John, got home early from some regular business trip and walked into his house in time to overhear the last part of my conversation with Rachel about our relationship. He had a big argument with her and demanded to know who she was talking to. He told me that he had some suspicions about her based on the changes in their relationship. He had put an AirTag in her car and followed it to the area once, where he saw her car parked in my driveway. Rachel had later told him that I was a girlfriend of hers from work and that she was hanging out. After hearing her conversation, he was able to connect the dots, so he jumped in her car to come over and confront me. I sat there for a while and finally picked up my phone, looking at Rachel's messages. They were exactly what you would expect. She was saying sorry, begging me to forgive her, etc. The only thing I could feel was numbness. She knew John had come to confront me. I played her voicemails and she bawled, telling me she was so sorry and that she loved me and never meant to hurt me. Everything you would expect. It was so hard to think straight that I zoned out, just trying to pull my thoughts together. A while later, there was a knock at my door again. I looked out the window to see a car driving away. The knock came again, so I opened the door to find Rachel holding a bag with tears streaming down her face and a large, ugly, red, swollen mark on her cheek. She'd been hit in the face. She didn't say anything and stood there trembling in the doorway, holding her bag. This was the woman I loved, and it hurt me to see her like this, even with the shock and pain I was feeling from her betrayal. I stepped back from the door and nodded for her to come in. Rachel stood in the living room and put her bag at her feet, looking at me with big, sad eyes. Seeing her like this tore at me, but I was still trying to process it and control my own anger. I'm assuming the look on my face mirrored my feelings, since she just stood there with tears running down her cheeks. I finally asked her if she was okay, and she put one hand to her cheek and nodded. I approached her, looked closely at her face, then got her some ice. I pointed at a chair, and she sat down. After handing her the bag of ice, I took her suitcase, brought it to my guest room, and placed it on the bed. I shut the door and returned to the kitchen, where she sat at the island. It looked like she was going to say something to me, so I held up my hand and spoke first. I told her I wanted to talk first, and that she needed to let me finish before saying anything. Rachel nodded and looked down at the counter in front of her. I explained to her what happened when John showed up and what we talked about. Tears continued running down her face, and I could tell she wanted to say something, but I reminded her to wait. I then launched into my feelings of hurt and betrayal over her lying. I raised my voice at some point, and she started sobbing. It took me a few minutes to calm down, and then I told her I had questions for her and wanted her to answer me truthfully if she had feelings for me. I told her I'd read her messages and listened to her voicemail. She looked at me like she was pleading, but I held my hand for her to stop. After looking into her eyes again for a minute, I told her I wanted to know why I should allow her in my life after the betrayal she put me through. I reiterated that she needed to be honest, or I would insist she leave. Rachel took a deep breath and timidly started telling me her story from when we met. She said that she had been living in an abusive relationship with her husband of 3 years and was miserable until we met. She never intended for us to start seeing each other, but she decided to reach out to me after a particularly ugly fight between her and John. She said that he had mostly been verbally and psychologically abusive, but it had turned physical about the time we started dating. She said that a few times she had stayed away from seeing me for more than a week to allow bruising or marks to heal. It took her an hour or so to get through the history of how we are sitting in my house now. She was still teary-eyed, and then asked if I could forgive her. I did believe most, if not all, of her story, since it seemed very genuine, and the facts seemed to line up. Rachel said that she had some friends that she could get to verify the abusive relationship. They had been encouraging her to leave John, but she feared the consequences. I wanted to be angry at her for the betrayal and lies. This was obviously tempered by my feelings for her and her compelling story. I sat there thinking hard about those feelings, trying to sort out everything going on in my head. It was hard to believe that Rachel was so different from the person I thought I knew. She was married, and I never even suspected it. Although she was a victim in her marriage to John, she lied to me when she could have taken the high road and come clean before we got serious. The joke was on me because I'd actually been thinking about what it would be like to be married to her. When I told her this, she completely broke down and then dropped a bomb on me. She said that she hadn't had a physical relationship with her husband in months, going back to our first sexual encounter that night after going to the diner. I asked her if that was supposed to change my mind about the feeling of betrayal, and she said no. Then she said she was more than 2 weeks late on her period and had purchased a pregnancy test, but she was too afraid to take it since it would have to be my child. How do you even process something like this? I stood there looking at her, and she forged ahead, saying she'd never been late in her entire life, so she was sure she was pregnant. I asked her if she brought the test with her, and she said yes, it was in her bag. I asked her if she'd be willing to take the test right now. She said she would, but didn't know if she was far enough along for the test to be positive. I told her that was fine, but wanted her to test now. She retrieved the test and then went into the bathroom to take it. She came out a few minutes later and held it out for me. The test was already showing a positive indicator, and Rachel started sobbing. She walked to the front room, sat on the couch, and buried her face in her hands. I had to sit down because my head was swimming from what I can only describe as an emotional storm. My thoughts were interrupted by a banging on my door. It was her husband, John, and he was outside demanding to be let in so he could take his wife home. Rachel jumped up and pleaded with me not to let him take her. I told her to go to the bedroom and wait. I took my phone, started to record, and placed it on the counter, pointing at the door to catch the confrontation. I opened the door, and John attempted to push past me. When I put out my arm to block him, he swung at me. I was prepared, so I ducked enough that the blow just grazed the side of my head. He'd thrown a haymaker trying to put me down quickly. I threw my own punch and connected low on his jaw, which deflected down into his throat. I could tell I hit him hard, and he dropped to his knees, grabbing at his throat. He was making a gurgling sound and was having trouble breathing. He toppled over backward and started thrashing around. I called 911 to have them send a police officer and an ambulance. I explained to the operator that he had stormed into my house and assaulted me. The operator said that she would dispatch emergency service to my house immediately. The cops showed up about 10 minutes later, and John was now sitting up, forcing himself to take deliberate breaths. I helped him into a sitting position and told him that an ambulance was on the way. The paramedics arrived a few minutes later and started working on John. I gave a statement to the cops and ended up giving them a rundown of the situation, including showing them the video. The cops then spoke to Rachel and took her statement regarding the bruise now plainly visible on her cheek from John striking her earlier. The officer gave me the stink eye when I explained that Rachel and I had been dating and she was married. When I said, I didn't know, he just nodded, but it seemed he didn't believe it. When Rachel recounted the day's events, she admitted to the cop that I didn't know about her husband until today. The police took pictures of Rachel's face and asked her if she wanted to press charges. She looked at me, and I told her she needed to stand up for herself to be free of him. She nodded and told the police that she would press charges. The cop asked me if I wanted to press charges for assault, and I said yes. Even though he was probably rightfully angry at Rachel, the guy had barged into my house, pushed me aside, and then assaulted me. The police asked for me to provide the video as evidence. John was treated and hustled off by the paramedics, and the police followed them to the local hospital. Rachel was sobbing and apologizing for John's actions, but I waved her off. I was still feeling betrayed, but the situation tempered it. I let Rachel stay in my guest room until she knew what was happening with her husband. Both Rachel and I got a restraining order in place against John. Rachel moved her personal belongings out of the marital home and put them into storage. After getting out on bail, John was allowed to live in the house since Rachel was staying in my guest room. No, we did not resume our physical relationship. John was ultimately convicted of both assault counts. The combined sentences added up to 6 months of incarceration and a hefty fine. Rachel filed for divorce, which was granted while he was in jail. She was awarded everything she requested but chose not to ask for alimony since she had essentially left their marriage. I'm sure people are curious about how Rachel and I are doing. We are still living together in a co-parenting relationship with maybe a little more to it. It took me a while to trust her. Logically, I know why she did what she did, but part of me was waiting to hear that I wasn't the only one she was stepping out with. I told her that and expressed that not telling me the truth from the start took away my ability to make an informed decision about dating her. She took this hard, but agreed that she should have taken the high road and discussed it with me before we got intimate. She said she was just too embarrassed about it. She did apologize profusely, so I'm sort of in a mental and emotional limbo. The baby was the part that persuaded me to stay. I guess you could effectively argue that I've been baby-trapped. Rachel did turn out to be a fantastic mother. After discussing it, we decided she should be a stay-at-home mom for 2 years. In for a penny. She cried during labor, holding my hand and telling me she loved me. Yes, Rachel volunteered to do a prenatal paternity test to help with the trust issues I was having. The baby is mine. I'll have to decide our future at some point, but that can wait for now. Do I know that Rachel will always be faithful to me? No, but I'm willing to take that risk since I believe she came from a terrible place with John, and there is no way I will not be part of my child's life. Yeah, I hope I'm making the right decision. For those of you dealing with infidelity, my situation probably differs from most of you, but I wish you all the best. Stay strong.
I only post new and unique content. Please like and subscribe.